I still remember the sound my phone made that afternoon because it was one of those old custom ringtones my tenant Lisa used for emergencies only, 3 short buzzes back to back. I was halfway through signing invoices at my office in downtown Spokane when I picked up and heard her screaming before I could even say hello. "Mark, my truck is gone." At first, I honestly thought it got stolen, and for maybe 5 seconds, I felt bad for her, until she said the words that changed everything. "There's a towing sticker on the ground." The funny thing is, if that tow truck driver had picked literally any other vehicle on the block, none of what happened afterward would have happened. But they picked the wrong truck, in the wrong parking lot, owned by the wrong guy. And about a month later, I'd bought the towing company that took it. Now, before this turns into one of those internet revenge stories where everybody suddenly becomes a genius billionaire overnight, let me explain something. I'm not rich. I'm not some shark investor. I'm a 52-year-old commercial property owner who spent most of his life fixing HVAC units, chasing late rent checks, and eating gas station sandwiches in work boots. The building I own isn't glamorous either. It's an old brick office building near downtown Spokane with creaky elevators and pipes that complain every winter. But the one thing that made that property valuable was parking. 12 private parking spaces behind the building, fenced in, clearly marked, and worth their weight in gold because downtown parking out there is a nightmare. I had lawyers draw those spaces into every tenant lease because people will forgive bad coffee in the lobby. They will not forgive losing parking. For almost 9 years, everything worked fine. Quiet tenants, steady rent, no drama. Then the building next door sold. The new owners were this couple from San Diego, Trevor and Elise Brennan, young, polished, startup money written all over them. Trevor had that smooth confidence some people mistake for charm, expensive haircut, rolled-up sleeves, talking like every sentence was a TED Talk. Elise barely spoke at first, but when she did, she had this cold corporate smile that made you feel like she was mentally calculating whether you were useful or not. They bought the neighboring property in cash and immediately started converting it into some kind of creative media hub. Suddenly, there were contractors everywhere, dumpsters in the alley, workers carrying glass panels through the street at 7 in the morning. The whole block changed in about 2 weeks. The first time Trevor introduced himself, he walked into my office holding 2 coffees like we were already friends. "Hey, neighbor," he said, smiling real wide. Figured we should get to know each other. And honestly, I wanted to like him. I really did. I even walked him around the back lot myself. Showed him exactly where our property line sat. I pointed at the signs and said, "These 12 spots belong to my building. Tenants only." People get territorial about parking around here. He nodded immediately. "Totally understand." That should have been the end of it. 3 weeks later, Lisa's truck disappeared. I drove down to the lot myself after she called me. Empty parking spot. Little scraps of broken glass glittering near the curb. Bright orange towing sticker stuck to the pavement like somebody left a middle finger behind. Iron Claw Recovery. $450 to retrieve the vehicle. Lisa was furious, pacing back and forth beside me in her nurse scrubs because she'd just gotten off a 12-hour shift at the hospital. "I parked exactly where I always park," she kept saying. "My permit's literally hanging on the mirror." I called the towing number right there in the lot. Guy answers sounding half asleep. "Iron Claw." I said, "Yeah, you towed one of my tenant vehicles from private property." He goes, "If it was removed, we had authorization." "I am the authorization," I snapped. "I own the property." Silence. Then the guy clears his throat and says, "Hold on. You're saying Trevor Brennan doesn't own those spaces?" That was the first moment my stomach dropped, because suddenly this wasn't a mistake anymore. Trevor had told them those spots belonged to him. I hung up and called Trevor immediately. He answered all casual too, like we were buddies. "Hey Mark, what's up?" "What's up is you had my tenant's truck towed out of my parking lot." Little pause, then he laughs. Actually laughs. "Well, our contractors needed overflow parking," he said. "Honestly, your signs looked temporary. Elise thought the spaces came with our side." I remember gripping the phone so hard my hand hurt. "Trevor, those spaces are deeded to my building." Another pause, longer this time. Then his voice changed completely. "According to our survey," he said slowly, "that property line cuts through at least half those spots." That sentence right there, that was the beginning of the war. I didn't even answer Trevor for a second because I was too busy staring at the parking lot behind my building, trying to process the absolute nerve of what I'd just heard. 9 years. 9 years those spaces existed exactly where they were, with signs, permits, tenant agreements, maintenance records, snow removal invoices. Hell, Google Street View showed those same parking signs going back almost a decade. And suddenly this guy from California shows up with a fresh haircut and a startup podcast voice, telling me the land might actually belong to him. I finally said, "Then your survey's wrong." Trevor let out this little amused breath like he'd been expecting that answer. "Well, our attorneys disagree." And then he hung up on me. That part stayed with me more than it should have. Not because it was rude, but because it told me exactly who he was. Some people argue because they're emotional. Trevor argued because he liked leverage. He liked pushing people into corners and seeing whether they folded quietly or made things expensive. Unfortunately for him, I've spent most of my adult life dealing with contractors, city inspectors, insurance adjusters, and tenants who think plumbing leaks magically fix themselves. I don't fold easy. The next morning, I drove straight over to my attorney's office. His name was Walter Grady, 71 years old, suspenders every day, smelled faintly like coffee and old paper. Walter had handled property law since before Trevor Brennan was born, and after 20 minutes of reviewing the original plat maps and county records, he leaned back in his chair and said the exact sentence I wanted to hear. "They're bluffing." He slid the paperwork across the desk with one finger. "Your property line is crystal clear. Those parking spaces belong to you." I asked him how someone could even claim otherwise. Walter shrugged. "Simple. They assume dragging this through court will frustrate you enough to compromise." And honestly, he was probably right, because court takes time, and time is expensive. Walter sent over a cease and desist letter that afternoon demanding reimbursement for leases towing fee and immediate termination of unauthorized towing activity on my property. Trevor's attorney responded 2 days later with the kind of polished legal nonsense only expensive firms can produce. They claimed there was reasonable boundary ambiguity and proposed we temporarily share parking accommodations pending official review. Temporarily share. That phrase alone made my blood boil. What they really meant was, "We know these spots aren't ours, but we think we can bully you long enough to use them anyway." So Walter filed suit, and that's when things got ugly. See? I assumed once lawyers got involved, Trevor would back off until the judge sorted things out. Normal people usually do. Trevor wasn't normal. 3 days after the lawsuit was filed, another tenant got towed, then another, then another. Every single time, same company, Iron Claw Recovery. Same routine. Tow truck would show up within an hour of one of my tenants parking there, haul the vehicle away, then charge $600 to get it back because apparently now they were adding after-hours administrative fees. One tenant threatened to break her lease over it. Another started parking 3 blocks away and walking in the rain every morning because he was terrified his truck would disappear again. And every single time I called Trevor, he gave me the same calm, infuriating answer: "Take it up with the court." I started sleeping badly after that. No joke. I'd wake up at 3 in the morning replaying conversations in my head, thinking about worst-case scenarios. Because people who've never owned property think these disputes are just legal paperwork, but when tenants stop feeling secure, they leave. And when commercial tenants leave downtown properties, sometimes they don't come back for months. One night, I drove past the building around midnight just to check the lot. Rain coming down sideways, streetlights flickering, whole city dead quiet except for traffic in the distance. And there it was again, one of my tenants' SUVs halfway up the Iron Claw tow ramp. I pulled over so fast I almost hit the curb. Tow operator steps out looking annoyed already. Big guy, beard, reflective jacket soaked from the rain. "You can't tow that vehicle," I yelled over the storm. Guy points at the paperwork in his hand. "Authorized removal." "By who?" He hesitated, and that hesitation told me everything. Because deep down, these guys know. The driver finally sighed and said, "Look, man, I don't make the rules. We get called, we tow." Then he added something that changed the entire direction of the story. "Honestly, this account's the only thing keeping us afloat right now." At the time, I didn't react, but those words stuck in my head the whole drive home. Keeping us afloat. A week later, I found myself sitting across from the owner of Iron Claw Recovery at a diner off Division Street. His name was Dennis Pike, mid-60s, looked exhausted in a permanent kind of way. You know the type. Guy who'd probably worked every day for 40 years and somehow still looked worried about bills. He stirred his coffee while talking about diesel prices, insurance costs, city permit fees. Tao businesses apparently operate on razor-thin margins unless they land major contracts, and Trevor's development project was one of their biggest. I asked him casually, "You ever think about selling?" Dennis laughed immediately. "Nobody buys tow companies unless they hate themselves." I laughed too, but then I asked again, and this time I wasn't joking. The funny part is, I didn't even fully know why I was asking yet. I just remember driving home afterward feeling this weird little spark in the back of my brain, like a puzzle piece had shifted into place. Over the next few days, I started digging. Ironclaw only had 3 trucks. One was nearly 15 years old. Their city contracts were weak. Their financials looked rough. Dennis had taken out loans against 2 vehicles just to stay operational during the previous winter. The company wasn't thriving. It was surviving. And suddenly I realized something Trevor hadn't. He thought the towing company worked for him. But the towing company worked for money. That's different. I met Dennis again the following Friday, this time in his office beside the impound yard. Tiny little place that smelled like cigarettes and printer toner. Tao radios crackling constantly in the background. I asked him straight up, what would it take? Dennis stared at me for a long moment like he was trying to decide whether I'd lost my mind. Then he named a number, $87,000. I almost laughed because the number was both way higher and way lower than I expected. For 2 days, I wrestled with the idea. It was a stupid amount of money for me, not impossible, but uncomfortable. I had savings, some investments. I could make it happen if I really wanted to. But was I seriously considering buying an entire towing company out of spite? That sounded insane. Then Lisa called me again. Another tenant got towed, and this time the tenant's car had medical equipment inside that they needed for home care visits. I remember sitting alone in my office after that call, staring at the wall while traffic moved outside the window, and something inside me just quietly hardened, because at that point it wasn't about parking anymore. It was about arrogance. Trevor Brennan genuinely believed money made him untouchable. He thought delays, pressure, and legal exhaustion would eventually force me to back down, and maybe most people would have. But that night, I called Dennis back. I said, "Let's make a deal." Dennis didn't even try to hide his shock when I showed up Monday morning with a cashier's check and a lawyer beside me. He kept blinking at the paperwork like maybe he thought I'd changed my mind halfway through signing it. Truthfully, part of me thought the same thing. Because there I was, a middle-aged property owner with high blood pressure and a bad shoulder, buying a towing company out of pure frustration. My daughter found out that night and said, "Dad, this is either the smartest thing you've ever done or the beginning of your villain arc." Honestly, fair question. But once the papers cleared, Ironclaw Recovery became mine. 3 trucks, 1 cramped impound lot, 6 employees who all looked terrified the new owner was about to fire them. Instead, the first thing I did was call every tenant who'd paid towing fees over the previous month and reimburse them personally. Some of them thought I was joking. One woman actually got emotional on the phone because she'd had to put the towing charge on a credit card she was already struggling to pay off. That conversation stayed with me a while, because Trevor probably never even thought about what $600 meant to regular people. To him, it was inconvenience money. To my tenants, it was groceries, prescriptions, utility bills. The second thing I did was terminate Trevor Brennan's towing authorization contract immediately. No warning, no negotiation, just canceled. Then I ordered brand new parking signs for all 12 spaces behind my building. Bigger signs this time, bright reflective lettering. Our setted towing in Foreman. Ironclaw Recovery. Underneath that was the company phone number, my company number. I'll admit it, standing there watching those signs go up felt incredibly satisfying. Maybe too satisfying. 3 days later, Trevor called me. Not angry at first either. Confused. Like his brain physically couldn't process what had happened. "Mark," he said slowly over the phone, "did you seriously buy Ironclaw?" I leaned back in my chair and looked out the office window at the parking lot. "Yep." Long silence. Then finally, "That's completely insane." I laughed a little. "Maybe, but it solved my towing problem." That's when the anger hit his voice for real. "You can't retaliate against us like this." "Retaliate?" I said. "Trevor, you had nurses and office workers towed out of legally assigned parking spaces for over a month. You filed a lawsuit against us because you were trespassing." Another silence. Then he lowered his voice and said something that honestly explained his entire personality better than anything else ever could. "You could have just worked with us." Worked with us. Meaning, surrender quietly. I said, "No, Trevor. You just assumed I would." and for the first time since this whole mess started, he had absolutely nothing to say back. After that call, things shifted fast. Without towing enforcement, Trevor's contractors started flooding nearby public parking areas instead. The city got complaints almost immediately. Then one of his subcontractors blocked an alley access road and got hit with municipal fines. A couple weeks later, rumors started floating around downtown that the Brennan project was bleeding cash because construction delays kept stacking up. Meanwhile, something unexpected happened with Ironclaw. Business improved. A lot. Turns out, Dennis had run the company like a guy trying to survive another winter. I started running it like an actual business. Updated dispatch software, cleaner contracts, better communication with property owners. I even gave drivers bonuses for avoiding unnecessary conflict during calls. Tow truck companies have horrible reputations for a reason. But weirdly enough, once you stop treating everybody like criminals, people stop screaming at your drivers quite as much. One afternoon, Dennis came by the office just to check in. He looked around the place, saw the updated systems running, and shook his head laughing. "You know," he said, "I spent 20 years trying to keep this company alive, and you bought it just to win an argument over parking spaces." I smiled and said, "Yeah, but now I kind of like it." The court hearing finally happened about 2 months later. Trevor showed up in this expensive navy suit looking tired for the first time since I'd met him. Elise was there too, stone-faced, tapping something on her phone non-stop. Walter absolutely dismantled them. Original plats, lease agreements, historical maintenance records, tax documents. Even old satellite imagery showing the parking lot configuration hadn't changed in nearly a decade. Trevor's survey argument collapsed in under an hour. At one point, the judge actually adjusted her glasses, looked directly at Trevor's attorney, and said, "I'm struggling to understand why this case was brought to court at all." That was probably my favorite moment in the entire hearing. The final judgment hit them hard. Full reimbursement for all towing fees, attorney costs, civil penalties, just over $14,000 total. But honestly, the money wasn't the satisfying part. The satisfying part was watching Trevor walk past me outside the courthouse afterward without saying a single word. No smirk, no TED Talk voice, nothing, just silence. And weirdly enough, that silence taught me something. People like Trevor go through life believing confidence is the same thing as authority. They assume if they push hard enough, most people will eventually get tired and move aside. And to be fair, most people do, because fighting back is exhausting. But every once in a while, they run into somebody stubborn enough, petty enough, or maybe just tired enough to push back harder. Now here's the part people argue with me about whenever I tell this story. Did I overreact? Maybe. Buying a towing company to settle a parking dispute is objectively ridiculous. I can admit that. But at the same time, Trevor could have stopped this entire thing after the very first phone call. He could have apologized, paid Lisa's towing fee, respected the property line. Instead, he treated regular people like collateral damage because he assumed nobody would challenge him. That's the part I still think about. So honestly, I want to know what you think. Was I justified? Or did I become just as petty as he was by the end of it? Let me know in the comments. Because even now, years later, people around Spokane still argue about it whenever this story comes up.